For 300 cycles, Commander Vrather believed he had seen everything the galaxy could throw at him. Then a human janitor named Eddie Martinez stepped into a training arena filled with genetically engineered warriors, and somehow defeated every single one of them. Commander Vrather had served the Galactic Guard for more than 3 centuries, and in that long career, he had witnessed battles that reshaped entire star systems. He had commanded fleets through asteroid storms, negotiated ceasefires between species that communicated through mathematics rather than language, and survived the brutal political maneuvering of Centauri Prime's diplomatic councils. Nothing in those 300 years, however, prepared him for the strange sequence of events that began on an otherwise routine inspection day aboard the Galactic Peacekeeping Station. The station itself floated quietly in orbit around a dull, blue gas giant on the far edge of neutral territory. It was a place designed for order, discipline, and preparation. Within its armored walls trained the finest soldiers the Galactic Guard had ever produced. These warriors were not simply recruits. They were engineered from birth to become masters of combat. Their bones were strengthened, their reflexes sharpened, and their minds conditioned to process battlefield information faster than most species could blink. By the time they reached adulthood, they were considered nearly unstoppable. On that particular morning, Commander Vrather walked toward Training Bay 7 to observe one of the final examinations for a new unit of elite guards. The chamber was enormous, a circular arena surrounded by observation platforms and reinforced viewing glass. Inside the arena stood 12 warriors wearing combat armor that gleamed beneath the white training lights. Each soldier carried a practice weapon designed to simulate the lethality of real battlefield equipment without actually killing the participants. The exercise was meant to test coordination, reflexes, and tactical awareness under pressure. Vrather paused beside the observation rail and folded his arms behind his back as the instructors began issuing commands. The warriors moved with perfect discipline, forming defensive patterns and attack formations that had been practiced thousands of times during their training cycles. Every motion was calculated. Every step was part of a carefully designed combat doctrine developed by the greatest strategists in the Guard. Watching them felt like observing a living machine designed solely for war. Then the arena door slid open with a quiet, mechanical hiss. The instructors barely noticed at first. A single human walked into the training bay, pushing a small cleaning cart. He wore a plain gray maintenance uniform with a station identification badge clipped to the chest. In one hand he held a mop that still dripped with water from a recently cleaned corridor. The man appeared completely relaxed, humming a tune under his breath as if he had simply wandered into the wrong room by mistake. Commander Vrather frowned slightly. Humans were still relatively new members of the Galactic Coalition, and most of them served in support roles across the station. Maintenance crews, engineering assistants, cargo handlers. They were known for their adaptability and strange sense of humor, but no one had ever considered them part of the Guard's elite combat culture. The presence of a janitor in the middle of an active training exercise was unusual, but at first it seemed like a minor scheduling mistake. The humans stopped near the edge of the arena floor and looked around at the armored warriors circling one another. Instead of panicking or retreating, he simply tilted his head with mild curiosity, as though trying to understand why a dozen heavily armed soldiers were practicing elaborate combat movements in the same room he needed to clean. He rested the mop handle against his shoulder and waited patiently, apparently assuming the exercise would end soon so he could finish his work. One of the instructors finally noticed him and shouted an order for the janitor to remain outside the combat zone. The human raised one hand in a casual gesture of apology and began pushing the cleaning cart toward the wall, clearly intending to stay out of the way. Unfortunately, at that exact moment, the training scenario escalated. The 12 warriors launched into their next phase of combat drills, moving rapidly across the arena in a coordinated attack pattern that simulated a chaotic battlefield. Their weapons flashed with bright pulses of training energy as they engaged one another. The sudden motion spread across the floor like a storm of metal and armor. In the confusion, the human janitor stepped backward to avoid one of the charging soldiers and accidentally slipped on a patch of freshly mopped floor. What happened next would later become one of the most discussed training incidents in the history of the Galactic Guard, because when Eddie Martinez fell, he did not fall alone. Eddie Martinez had never planned to become involved in a military training exercise. In fact, until that moment, he had been thinking about something far less dramatic, specifically the schedule of maintenance tasks he still needed to finish before the end of his shift. The cleaning cart beside him held several bottles of industrial detergent, a stack of folded cloths, and a mop bucket filled with cloudy water from the corridor outside. To Eddie, the enormous combat arena was simply another floor that eventually needed to be cleaned. When his foot slipped on the thin layer of water he had accidentally tracked across the polished surface, his body reacted in the same instinctive way it always did when he lost balance while working. Instead of falling flat onto his back, he twisted sideways and grabbed the nearest object to steady himself. Unfortunately, the nearest object happened to be one of the armored warriors rushing past him as part of the training maneuver. The soldier did not expect resistance from a maintenance worker. The entire exercise had been designed around combat with opponents who understood the same tactics and patterns. When Eddie's hand caught the warrior's arm, the movement disrupted the carefully timed attack formation. The soldier stumbled forward, his balance shifting just enough to collide with another guard who was already mid-step in a defensive turn. From the observation platform above the arena, Commander Wrather leaned forward slightly. At first, it looked like a minor interruption, the sort of clumsy accident that sometimes happened during large training simulations. But as the two warriors struggled to regain their balance, Eddie instinctively pulled his mop handle closer to his chest to keep it from slipping away. The long metal pole swung upward in a quick arc. The motion was not meant to strike anyone. Eddie had simply tried to prevent the mop from falling into the middle of the combat zone. However, the movement intersected perfectly with the path of a third warrior who was lunging forward to continue the drill. The mop handle clipped the soldier's wrist at just the wrong moment, knocking the practice weapon out of his grip. The weapon clattered loudly against the arena floor. For a fraction of a second, the entire formation hesitated. Training doctrine taught the Galactic Guard to react instantly to any unexpected change on the battlefield. The warriors adjusted their positions, redirecting their attention toward the source of the disruption. In the center of the arena now stood a confused human janitor, holding a dripping mop while 3 elite guards attempted to regain their footing around him. Eddie blinked several times, clearly unsure why everyone had suddenly stopped moving. From his perspective, he had simply bumped into a few armored soldiers while trying not to fall. He lifted one hand again in a polite gesture, the same one he used whenever he accidentally blocked a hallway with his cleaning cart. "Sorry," he said automatically, though his voice was barely audible across the arena. Unfortunately, the next moment made the situation even more complicated. One of the warriors, still following the instincts drilled into him since childhood, interpreted the movement of the mop handle as a potential weapon swing. His training demanded immediate response. The soldier lunged forward to disarm the perceived threat before it could strike again. Eddie reacted the way anyone might when a heavily armored alien suddenly charged at them. He moved, not with deliberate combat strategy, but with the quick reflex of someone who had spent years maneuvering heavy cleaning equipment through crowded station corridors. He stepped sideways to avoid the incoming soldier, pulling the mop handle with him. The charging warrior's own momentum carried him past the human and straight into the path of another guard who had been approaching from the opposite direction. The collision echoed through the training bay. Two armored bodies crashed together, with enough force to send both soldiers sliding across the polished floor. Their training weapons skidded away in different directions, spinning toward the outer edge of the arena. Eddie stared at the scene in growing confusion, still gripping the mop handle as if it were the only stable object left in the room. Above them, Commander Wrather felt the first faint stirrings of disbelief, because what had just happened should not have been possible. Commander Wrather had observed thousands of training exercises throughout his long career, and he understood exactly how the doctrine of the Galactic Guard functioned under pressure. Every warrior in the arena had been conditioned to respond to disruption with precise countermeasures. When a formation broke, the soldiers were trained to isolate the threat, contain it, and restore control of the battlefield within seconds. That was the theory written into every tactical manual used by the Guard. Yet the scene unfolding in the training bay refused to follow that theory in any predictable way. On the arena floor, the warriors were already adjusting their positions. The two guards who had collided with one another rolled apart and pushed themselves upright, their armor scraping faintly against the polished surface. Another soldier retrieved a dropped practice weapon and turned toward the human standing near the center of the arena. Their movements were quick and disciplined, but the brief disruption had already broken the smooth rhythm of the exercise. Instead of a coordinated formation, the warriors were now reacting individually, each attempting to regain tactical advantage. Eddie Martinez, meanwhile, was still trying to understand why a routine cleaning task had turned into something that looked suspiciously like a military confrontation. The mop handle remained clutched in both of his hands, mostly because he did not know where else to put it. He glanced from one armored figure to another as the warriors slowly began circling him again. Their heavy boots produced dull metallic sounds against the arena floor, and the white lights above reflected sharply off their combat helmets. To Eddie, the entire situation felt absurdly misplaced, as if he had walked onto the set of a training simulation that no one had bothered to explain to him. One of the warriors approached cautiously, lowering his stance in preparation for a controlled disarm maneuver. The soldier's training demanded precision rather than aggression, and the practice weapon in his hand was designed to disable rather than injure. From the observation deck, Wrather could already predict the likely outcome. The guard would step inside the janitor's reach, twist the mop handle away, and escort the humans safely out of the combat zone. It would be an efficient solution to an awkward mistake, but the prediction failed almost immediately. As the warrior stepped forward, Eddie attempted to back away in order to give the soldier room. The movement caused the mop bucket on his cleaning cart to wobble slightly. Instinctively, he reached backward to steady it, pulling the mop handle with him in the process. The long pole swept across the narrow space between him and the approaching guard. The motion was unplanned and entirely defensive, yet it forced the soldier to halt his advance to avoid walking directly into the swinging handle. The brief hesitation created another opening for confusion. A second warrior moved in from Eddie's right side, attempting to take advantage of the distraction. The soldier's boots struck the still damp patch of floor that Eddie had mopped earlier, and the reduced friction altered his balance just enough to disrupt the precision of his approach. His foot slid a few centimeters farther than intended. That small miscalculation forced him to shift his weight abruptly to maintain stability. At that exact moment, Eddie turned his body to keep the cleaning cart from rolling away. The mop handle swung outward again, this time connecting gently, but firmly with the soldier's armored forearm. The impact was not strong enough to cause injury, yet it altered the guard's momentum just enough to redirect his step. Instead of regaining perfect footing, The warrior stumbled sideways into the path of a third soldier who had been preparing to secure Eddie from behind. The resulting tangle of armor and limbs was brief but chaotic. Two of the elite guards lost their balance simultaneously, and their training weapons struck the floor with sharp metallic sounds. Eddie's eyes widened as the soldiers attempted to disentangle themselves. From his perspective, the situation had become alarmingly complicated for reasons he could not fully understand. Up on the observation platform, Commander Wrather slowly straightened his posture. What he was witnessing no longer looked like a simple accident interfering with a torrent, with a tie with a tamang, with a diverse witnessing no longer looked like a simple accident interfering with a training exercise. The human janitor had not attacked anyone deliberately, yet every instinctive movement he made continued to disrupt the carefully engineered combat responses of the guard's most disciplined warriors, and the exercise was only becoming more unpredictable. The instructors stationed around the observation deck exchanged uncertain glances as the training scenario continued to spiral away from its intended structure. For centuries, the combat doctrine of the Galactic Guard had relied on precise reactions and disciplined coordination. Every exercise was designed to simulate controlled chaos while still remaining predictable to the soldiers who had trained their entire lives within the system. Yet the presence of a single confused human janitor had turned that structure into something strangely unstable. On the arena floor, the warriors regrouped once again, this time spreading out more carefully to surround the unexpected obstacle in their training environment. Their movements were slower now, less certain than before. Each guard adjusted position while watching the mop handle in Eddie Martinez's hands as if it were an unfamiliar weapon whose behavior they could not quite predict. The long pole glistened with droplets of water under the overhead lights, and the damp floor beneath their boots reflected the shifting figures in distorted patches of brightness. Eddie, meanwhile, had reached the uncomfortable conclusion that leaving the arena might be the best solution to everyone's problems. He glanced toward the large door through which he had entered, estimating the distance between himself and the exit. Unfortunately, the warriors had already formed a loose circle around him, and every direction he looked contained at least one heavily armored soldier who appeared very focused on whatever he might do next. The mop handle remained clutched in his grip, simply because it felt strange to drop his equipment in the middle of someone else's workspace. One of the senior instructors finally activated the training command channel and ordered the warriors to proceed with a controlled disarm and containment maneuver. The guards responded immediately, adjusting their stances in preparation for the coordinated move. From Wrather's perspective, the plan seemed reasonable. 12 elite warriors working together should have been more than capable of removing a maintenance worker from the arena without further disruption. The maneuver began with 2 soldiers advancing directly toward Eddie, while 3 others shifted position to block potential escape routes. Their steps were measured and deliberate, each movement calculated according to the combat formations drilled into them since childhood. The remaining guards prepared to close the circle once the human had been secured. Eddie noticed the approaching figures and instinctively stepped backward again. His heel struck the metal wheel of the cleaning cart, causing it to roll slightly across the damp floor. The sudden motion startled him just enough that he turned quickly to keep the cart from drifting away. As he reached out to steady the handle, the mop pole pivoted through the air in a broad, awkward sweep. The unexpected movement intersected with the approach of the nearest warrior. The soldier reacted instantly, raising an arm to deflect what appeared to be a defensive strike. The mop handle glanced off the guard's armor and bounced sideways, striking the edge of a second warrior's practice weapon. The weapon slipped from the soldier's grasp and slid across the polished surface, spinning toward the outer boundary of the arena. For a moment, the carefully planned containment maneuver dissolved into confusion again. One guard instinctively stepped forward to retrieve the lost weapon, while another attempted to compensate for the disrupted formation. Their movements overlapped in a way that forced both soldiers to shift directions simultaneously. The damp floor beneath them did not help their balance. Eddie lifted both hands slightly, trying to signal that none of this had been intentional. Unfortunately, the mop handle was still in his grip, and the upward motion caused the long pole to rise between him and the nearest warrior. The guard halted mid-step to avoid walking directly into it, and the hesitation rippled outward through the formation. From the observation deck, Commander Wrather slowly exhaled. The warriors were not failing because they lacked skill. They were failing because every instinctive movement from the human janitor introduced a variable their training had never considered. The mop handle, the cleaning cart, the damp floor, and the human's unpredictable reactions were combining into a sequence of disruptions that no combat doctrine had prepared them to counter. Down in the arena, Eddie Martinez was still trying very hard not to make the situation worse. Unfortunately, the more carefully he tried to move, the more complicated the exercise seemed to become. Commander Wrather rested both hands against the observation rail as the situation below continued to evolve in ways no training scenario had ever predicted. The warriors of the Galactic Guard were not inexperienced soldiers. They were the result of generations of careful engineering and relentless discipline. Their instincts were sharpened through thousands of hours of combat drills, designed to prepare them for every known battlefield variable. Yet the human janitor moving awkwardly around his cleaning cart had introduced a problem that none of those carefully constructed scenarios had ever addressed. On the arena floor, the warriors adjusted their positions again, this time approaching with noticeably greater caution. The earlier disruptions had forced them to abandon their usual speed and coordination. Instead of advancing as a single unit, they began closing the circle around Eddie in smaller, measured steps. Each soldier studied the mop handle carefully, attempting to anticipate its next movement, the way they would analyze an unfamiliar weapon during reconnaissance. Eddie Martinez, however, was not thinking about tactics at all. His attention was focused entirely on the cleaning cart that had slowly rolled a short distance away from him. The bucket inside it sloshed slightly whenever the cart shifted, threatening to spill cloudy water across the polished floor. He stepped toward the cart to steady it, worried more about creating a larger mess than about the armed soldiers surrounding him. The movement caused several warriors to react at once. Two guards stepped forward to intercept him before he could reach the cart. Their approach was controlled and deliberate, but the sudden motion startled Eddie enough that he instinctively raised the mop handle in front of him. The pole was never meant to be a weapon, yet its length created a barrier between him and the advancing soldiers. The nearest warrior attempted to push the handle aside while maintaining his balance on the damp floor dot. As soon as the guard's armored gauntlet made contact with the metal pole, Eddie pulled it back slightly to avoid losing his grip. The motion was small and defensive, but it changed the angle of the mop handle just enough to catch the soldier's wrist. The impact forced the guard's arm downward and disrupted the precise motion he had been executing. Another warrior moved in to assist, attempting to secure the mop handle before the human could swing it again. Unfortunately, the second soldier stepped onto a thin streak of water left behind by the cleaning cart's wheels. His foot slid a fraction farther than intended, and the shift in balance forced him to lean heavily against his partner to avoid falling. The two guards collided, awkwardly, their armor clanking together as they struggled to recover their footing. The mop handle slipped free from their grasp and swung sideways through the narrow gap between them. Eddie immediately stepped back, trying to keep the pole out of the way, but the movement only added more confusion to the scene. A third warrior, approaching from behind, attempted to seize the opportunity while the others regained balance. He lunged forward with a controlled disarm maneuver designed to secure Eddie's arms without causing injury. The technique was flawless in theory, practiced countless times during training simulations. Yet the human reacted instinctively the moment he sensed movement at his back. Eddie turned quickly, while pulling the mop handle close to his body. The pole rotated across the soldier's chest plate as the warrior reached forward. The unexpected contact altered the guard's momentum just enough that his own forward motion carried him past the human instead of stopping in front of him. His shoulder struck the edge of the cleaning cart with a metallic thud, sending the cart rolling several feet across the arena floor. The bucket inside tipped slightly, spilling a thin wave of water that spread across the polished surface in a widening arc. For the warriors surrounding Eddie, the growing patch of water created yet another unstable variable beneath their boots. Their armor was designed for battlefields filled with dust, debris, and uneven terrain, but the slick surface of a freshly mopped training floor introduced a different kind of hazard. Eddie watched the spreading water with a worried expression. From his perspective, the situation had become an absolute disaster. Instead of finishing a simple cleaning assignment, he had somehow interrupted a military exercise and now appeared to be making the arena even messier with every passing second dot above them. Commander Wrather slowly shook his head in disbelief, because, despite all the chaos unfolding below, the human janitor had still not intentionally attacked a single one of the elite warriors surrounding him. Yet somehow the exercise was continuing to unravel around him all the same. Commander Wrather had begun the morning expecting to observe a routine demonstration of discipline and precision, the kind of training exercise that reinforced the reputation of the Galactic Guard across dozens of star systems. Instead, he now found himself watching a situation that no instructor in the history of the Guard had ever designed or rehearsed. The arena floor had become an unpredictable field of shifting balance, scattered weapons and spreading water, while at the center of it all stood a human janitor, whose only visible objective seemed to be preventing his cleaning equipment from causing further damage. The warriors surrounding Eddie Martinez were no longer treating the situation as a simple interruption. Their instincts had adjusted to the reality that the unexpected human in their training zone was repeatedly disrupting their carefully controlled movements. Each guard now approached with heightened focus, analyzing the janitor's posture and the angle of the mop handle as if studying an unfamiliar combat technique. The circle around Eddie tightened slowly as the soldiers attempted to restrict his movement without creating another cascade of collisions. Eddie noticed the narrowing space immediately. He glanced again toward the exit door on the far side of the arena, measuring the distance while trying to decide whether he could slip past the armored figures without interfering further. The cleaning cart had rolled several meters away during the earlier confusion, leaving him standing alone with nothing but the mop in his hands. He held the pole upright in front of him. He held the HFY in front of him, more as a way to keep it from dragging across the floor than as any form of defense. One of the warriors stepped forward with deliberate calm, moving slowly enough that the damp floor would not disrupt his balance. His objective was clear: approach carefully, control the mop handle, and escort the human out of the combat zone before the exercise deteriorated any further. The soldier's boots touched down with careful precision as he closed the distance between them. Eddie, trying to cooperate, shifted sideways to give the guard a clear path toward the mop handle. Unfortunately, his foot brushed against the thin film of water that had spread across the polished surface after the bucket tipped earlier. The sudden loss of traction caused him to slide a short distance to the side. Instinctively, he planted the end of the mop against the floor to steady himself. The pole struck the surface with a sharp, metallic tap. That small action created an unexpected obstacle directly in the warrior's path. The guard adjusted his step to avoid tripping over the pole, twisting his body slightly to pass around it. At that exact moment, another soldier approached from the opposite direction, attempting to assist in securing the janitor before he could slip again. Their movements intersected at the worst possible angle. The first guard shifted his weight to avoid the mop handle while the second attempted to close the gap between them. Both warriors reacted quickly, but the damp floor reduced their ability to correct the sudden change in balance. Their armored shoulders collided with a dull impact that echoed across the arena. The momentum of the collision forced them both backward, their boots sliding briefly across the wet surface. Eddie pulled the mop upright again, worried that it might trip someone if he left it on the ground. The motion brought the pole upward in a quick vertical arc. One of the nearby warriors flinched instinctively, raising his arm to shield his visor. The reaction caused the soldier to step back unexpectedly, bumping into another guard who had been attempting to close the circle behind him. Within seconds, the carefully arranged containment formation unraveled again. Several warriors shifted positions at once, trying to avoid stepping on the spreading water while maintaining their balance around the human. Their movements overlapped awkwardly, each adjustment forcing another soldier to compensate. The smooth choreography of the training exercise had been replaced by a chain reaction of corrections and counter-corrections. In the center of the arena, Eddie Martinez stood perfectly still, holding the mop upright like a flagpole while watching the armored figures move around him with increasing uncertainty. He looked genuinely concerned that someone might slip again, and his eyes followed every shifting step as if searching for a safe direction to leave. From the observation platform above, Commander Wrather could not help noticing a pattern that was becoming impossible to ignore. The human janitor never initiated an attack, never advanced toward the warriors, and never displayed any deliberate aggression. Yet every instinctive action he took continued to disrupt the elite soldiers around him, and the exercise was far from over. Commander Wrather had spent centuries studying combat behavior across dozens of intelligent species, and during that time he had learned that discipline alone did not guarantee control over a battlefield. Unpredictability was often the most dangerous factor in any engagement. Still, what he was observing inside Training Bay 7 stretched that principle to an almost absurd extreme. The elite warriors of the Galactic Guard were not being defeated through superior strength or advanced strategy. Instead, their perfectly rehearsed responses were unraveling under the pressure of a situation that no training program had ever imagined. Inside the arena, the soldiers attempted to restore order once again. Their commanders had trained them to adapt quickly when a formation failed, so the warriors began adjusting their spacing and slowing their movements even further. Instead of rushing toward the human janitor, they approached with deliberate caution, watching every motion of the mop handle as though it might transform into a dangerous weapon at any moment. The circle surrounding Eddie Martinez tightened gradually, leaving him less room to maneuver while they prepared another controlled disarm attempt. Eddie remained uncomfortably aware that he was still standing in the middle of someone else's training session. The scattered weapons on the floor, the damp patches spreading across the polished surface, and the frustrated movements of the soldiers around him all suggested that the situation had become far more complicated than a simple cleaning mistake. He shifted his weight carefully, trying to remain as still as possible, while also avoiding the thin pools of water near his boots. One of the warriors finally advanced with slow determination, moving directly toward Eddie while keeping both hands ready to secure the mop handle. His approach was calm and precise, each step measured to avoid slipping on the wet floor. The guard's visor reflected the bright overhead lights as he closed the final distance between them. Eddie noticed the soldier approaching and raised the mop slightly, intending to move it out of the way so the guard could take it. The gesture was meant to cooperate, but the long pole shifted awkwardly in his grip. As he adjusted his hands on the handle, the mop head at the far end dragged lightly across the surface of the arena. The damp strands of fabric spread a fresh streak of water across the floor. The approaching warrior reacted quickly, stepping aside to avoid the newly wet surface. His change of direction forced him to shift into the narrow space between two of his fellow soldiers. Both guards attempted to reposition at the same time, but the close spacing made their movements interfere with one another. Their armored shoulders brushed together, and the contact pushed one of them slightly off balance. The guard's boots slid across the slick patch left by the mop. He managed to stay upright, but the sudden loss of traction forced him to grab the nearest stable object for support. Unfortunately, the nearest object happened to be Eddie's cleaning cart, which had rolled closer during the earlier confusion. When the soldier's armored hand clamped onto the cart's handle, the lightweight frame jerked sideways across the floor. The bucket inside the cart tipped sharply. Another wave of cloudy water sloshed over the rim and spilled across the arena in a widening sheet that reflected the bright ceiling lights. Several warriors stepped back immediately to avoid the spreading puddle, but their rapid adjustments caused them to bump into one another again. The disciplined formation they had been trying to rebuild dissolved into scattered movement as each soldier attempted to maintain footing. Eddie stared at the mess with growing alarm. His original goal that morning had been to leave the training bay cleaner than he found it. Now the floor was covered in streaks of water, scattered equipment, and the confused footprints of a dozen elite guards trying not to slip. Above the arena, Commander Wrather pressed his fingers slowly against the railing as he watched the situation unfold. What fascinated him most was not the chaos itself, but the pattern hidden inside it. The human janitor had not displayed any formal combat training, yet his instinctive reactions were forcing the warriors to abandon their rigid doctrines again and again. For the first time in his long career, Wrather began to wonder if the problem was not the human in the arena. The problem might be the training of the warriors surrounding him. The Cauldrith warriors paused for a moment, glancing at each other as if searching for a collective plan. Normally, such moments were used to coordinate a synchronized counterattack, but the unpredictability introduced by the human janitor had thrown every expectation out the window. The water on the floor, the shifting cart, and the awkward placement of mop and bucket had created an environment that even the most disciplined soldiers couldn't fully anticipate. Every move they made seemed to be anticipated, or more accurately, disrupted by Eddie's simple, instinctive adjustments. Eddie wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, muttering to himself, "Okay. Don't slip, don't slip." He bent slightly to readjust the mop in his hands, carefully placing it between his palms for leverage. From the crowd of warriors circling him, one of the older soldiers, a veteran named Carrick, decided to make a direct approach. Carrick had fought through interstellar skirmishes, boarding operations, and planetary uprisings, and he had never hesitated before. Yet now, as he stepped forward, Eddie's mop subtly shifted with the slightest nudge. Catching Carrick off guard, the veteran's momentum carried him a fraction too far. He reached out instinctively to steady himself, but the mop head brushed against the smooth surface of the floor, sending him sliding sideways just long enough to collide lightly with another soldier. The collision created a domino effect, and suddenly, three of the warriors found themselves grappling with one another to maintain balance rather than advancing toward Eddie. The human, still gripping his mop, tilted it slightly to one side to avoid the last puddle of water. That tiny adjustment was enough for him to step safely through the chaos while the warriors floundered around him above the bay. Commander Wrather let out a slow exhale, one that carried more disbelief than relief. He had seen battles end because of superior tactics, overwhelming numbers, or advanced weaponry, but he had never witnessed victory created by what was essentially a combination of cleaning technique, spatial awareness, and instinctive timing. Eddie wasn't fighting in any traditional sense, yet the outcome was undeniable. Every soldier in the bay was momentarily humbled, scrambling to regain composure while the human remained upright, mop in hand, as if the floor itself obeyed his command. Eddie took a cautious step forward, glancing around at the bewildered faces of the Galactic Guards. Anyone want a mop?" he asked, his voice bright, though tinged with genuine concern. "I think you guys might need some practice. Floors are slippery." There was no malice, no bravado, just the innocent offer of assistance from someone who had spent most of his life keeping things clean. Carrick, who had regained his balance first, stared at Eddie, then down at the mop, then back at him again. Slowly, the veteran soldier nodded. It was a gesture not of submission, but of acknowledgement, recognition of skill in a form none of them had ever imagined. One by one, the other warriors lowered their stances, understanding that today they had not been bested by strength or training, but by something altogether different: precision, efficiency, and the kind of intuitive motion honed through a lifetime of small, seemingly insignificant actions. Eddie smiled faintly, giving a small shrug as he wiped the mop on the last streak of water. "Well, I guess that's it for today," he said. "Tomorrow we can work on squeegee technique. It's, even trickier." From above, Commander Vrather shook his head slowly, a mixture of awe and exasperation clouding his expression. The story of the human janitor defeating 12 elite warriors and now demonstrating the ability to disrupt the entire formation of an additional group would be told for cycles to come across the galactic peacekeeping station. He knew that by tomorrow, every officer, diplomat, and trainee would be talking about Eddie Martinez, the janitor who taught warriors to fight with mops, and he would have to update his own understanding of what combat effectiveness truly meant. And Eddie? He simply continued to move across the bay, carefully cleaning each corner, humming the same Earth song as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. In his mind, it was just another day at work, another floor to clean, an OP to master.